No one in Cedar Hollow believed Jet Calder would ever bow his head to another soul. He owned the river that fed every farm for 30 miles. He owned the mill, the granary, and the only bank willing to lend money before harvest. So, when the church doors opened on a grey Sunday morning, and he walked out with Eliza Marsh on his arm, the whole town stopped breathing at once. She wore a plain grey dress. Her hands, roughened from years of gripping reins and shoveling hay, were bare of any ring worth mentioning. Everyone knew her. She was the girl who slept in the loft above the Calder stables, the girl who smelled of horses and hard mornings, the girl whose own mother had scrubbed floors for wealthier families until the day she died. By noon, the story had traveled to every porch and every kitchen table in the valley. By evening, it had a name. They called it the scandal of the season. Some called it worse. Eliza did not flinch when the whispers started. She had grown up with whispers. What she had not grown up with was a husband who set his jaw and looked every gossiping face in the eye without apology. That first morning in the Calder mansion, sunlight poured through arched windows onto marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Eliza stood in a hallway, lined with oil paintings of stern ancestors, holding a bundle of yellow roses she had cut from the garden herself, because no one had thought to give her any. Behind her, through the tall windows, she could see a line of carriages gathered at the gate. The town had come to look, not to celebrate, to judge. She arranged the roses in an old blue vase with steady hands, though her heart was anything but steady. Somewhere down that same hallway, footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to a man used to rooms going quiet when he entered them. This is where her story truly begins. Not with a wedding, with a war she never asked to fight. If you want to see how far love can carry two people the whole world has already judged, stay with me to the end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going together. The bells of Cedar Hollow's chapel did not ring with joy that morning. They rang because the preacher had a duty to finish, not because anyone in the pews wished the newlyweds well. Eliza kept her chin level as she walked the aisle beside Jet. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times the night before, lying awake in the hayloft that had been her home since she was 12 years old. She had told herself that whatever happened, she would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her shrink. Jet Calder was 31 years old, tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet authority that came from being obeyed his whole life. He had inherited the largest ranch in 3 counties from a father who valued profit over people, and a mother who died before Jet turned 10. He had spent a decade building fences, buying land, and proving to every rival rancher in the territory that he could not be pushed around. No one expected him to fall for the girl who mucked his own stalls. It had started small. A kind word after a long day. A blanket left outside the loft door on the coldest night of winter. A quiet conversation by the paddock fence that turned into a dozen more. Jet found himself drawn to a woman who never once asked him for anything, who spoke to him as a person instead of a fortune, who worked harder before sunrise than most of his ranch hands worked all day. He proposed with no ring, no witnesses, only a promise spoken under the old oak tree at the edge of his land. Eliza said yes before she let herself think about what it would cost her. Now, standing outside the chapel doors, she understood exactly what it would cost. Coraline Ashworth stood at the front of the small crowd gathered outside, her lace parasol tilted just enough to shade her face, while leaving her sharp eyes free to study every detail of Eliza's plain dress. Coraline had spent 3 years expecting to become Mrs. Calder herself. She did not bother hiding her disgust. "A stable girl," she said, loud enough to carry. "He has made this family a joke." Beside her stood Rendell Bridger, owner of the second largest ranch in the valley, and a man who had wanted Jet's water rights for years. He said nothing, only watched with the calm patience of a man already calculating how to use this marriage against his rival. Eliza felt the weight of every stare as she and Jet climbed into the waiting carriage. She kept her eyes forward. Jet reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles, a small gesture meant only for her. "They will talk themselves out eventually," he said quietly. "Or they will find new things to say," Eliza answered. He did not argue. He knew she was likely right. The carriage pulled away from the chapel, past rows of townsfolk who had come only to witness, not to bless. Some turned their backs entirely. A few children waved before their mothers pulled them away. Eliza watched the town shrink behind them and wondered, not for the first time, if she had traded one kind of hard life for another. She thought of her mother, who had died believing her daughter would never rise above the stable floor. She thought of the years spent sleeping in a loft that leaked when it rained, waking before dawn to feed animals that belonged to a family who barely knew her name. She had not married Jet for his money. She had married him because, for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen more than her circumstances. That did not make the road ahead any easier. By the time the carriage reached the Calder estate, a small crowd had gathered at the iron gates. Word traveled fast in a town this size, and curiosity was a powerful thing. Eliza kept her back straight as they passed through, refusing to let her hands shake. Inside, the house staff lined up in the entrance hall, exactly as they would for any arriving mistress. Eliza recognized most of their faces from years of working the stables. None of them smiled. At the front of the line stood Quinn, the head housekeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had run the Calder household with iron discipline since Jet's mother passed. Quinn's greeting was polite. It was also cold enough to frost glass. "Welcome to your new home, Mrs. Calder," Quinn said, and the title sounded almost like an accusation. Eliza thanked her and walked past the staff toward the grand staircase, aware of every eye following her. Jet excused himself to handle ranch business that could not wait, leaving Eliza alone in a house larger than any building she had ever set foot inside. She found her way to a long hallway on the second floor, lined with portraits of Calder ancestors who had never known a day of hunger. At the end of the hall stood a small table beneath a tall window. On impulse, she went outside to the garden, cut an armful of yellow roses that no one else seemed to want, and brought them back to arrange in an old blue vase she found in a forgotten cupboard. It was a small thing. It was hers. She was still arranging the flowers when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Jet watching her from the far end of the hallway, still dressed in his wedding clothes, his expression unreadable in the afternoon light. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "They will not make this easy for you," he finally said. "I did not marry you for easy," Eliza answered. He crossed the distance between them and studied the roses she had chosen. "Yellow," he said. "My mother used to grow these." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother since the wedding. Eliza set down the last stem and looked at him fully. "Then I am glad I chose them," she said. Outside the tall windows, the last of the gathered carriages finally pulled away from the gate, taking their judgment with them, though Eliza knew it would return tomorrow in whispered form, carried from porch to porch across the whole valley. Tonight, at least, the house was quiet. Tonight, she allowed herself to believe that quiet might last. She did not yet know how short that peace would be. The Calder mansion had 31 rooms. Eliza counted them during her first week, mostly because counting rooms gave her something to do besides listen to the silence that followed her wherever she walked. She had grown up in a loft, with one window and a single trunk for all her belongings. Now she owned a bedroom larger than the entire barn she used to sleep above, filled with furniture she was almost afraid to touch. The size of it did not comfort her. It reminded her, every hour of every day, how far she still had to travel before anyone in this house would call her one of their own. Quinn ran the household with a precision that left no room for softness. Meals were served at exact times. Linens were changed on a strict schedule. The staff spoke to Eliza with correct titles and careful distance, the kind of distance reserved for someone they were still deciding whether to trust. Eliza tried, in her own quiet way, to close that distance. She offered to help fold linens on her second morning, and was told, politely but firmly, that a lady of the house did not perform such labor. She asked the cook, a heavy-set woman named Bettina, about the recipe for the bread served at dinner, hoping for an easy conversation. Bettina answered in 3 clipped words and turned back to her stove. It was Quinn who made her place in the household clearest of all. "You may have married the master," Quinn said one afternoon, catching Eliza in the hallway outside the kitchen. "But a title does not erase where a person comes from. The staff remember you scrubbing stalls. Some of us do not forget so easily." Eliza held the older woman's gaze without backing down. "Then I suppose we will have plenty of time to prove each other wrong." Quinn's expression did not soften, but something in her eyes shifted, just slightly, before she turned and walked away. Jet, for his part, tried to make the transition easier where he could. He asked Eliza to join him for morning coffee on the east terrace, where the view stretched over pastures she had once worked with her own hands, only from a different angle now. He brought her books from his study when he noticed her wandering the shelves. He made a point of introducing her, whenever possible, as his wife, with no qualifier attached, no apology in his tone. But Jet was also a man with a ranch to run, cattle to move, deals to strike with buyers who traveled from 3 states over. His days began before dawn and often ended well after dark. The hours Eliza spent alone in the great house stretched longer than the ones they spent together, and in those long hours, doubt found room to grow. She missed the stables more than she expected to. She missed the smell of hay and horse sweat, the simple honesty of physical work, the easy companionship of the other hands, who had never cared where she came from, because they came from the same place themselves. In this house, every room reminded her that she was a guest who had not yet earned her welcome. One evening, unable to sleep, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out to the stables that stood at the edge of the estate grounds. The familiar smell hit her before she reached the doors, warm and earthy, and something in her chest loosened for the first time in days. She found the old stable master, a weathered man named Amos, still awake and mending a bridle by lantern light. He had worked the Calder stables longer than Jet had been alive, and he did not rise or bow when Eliza entered, only nodding as if she had never left. "Couldn't you sleep in that big house?" Amos asked, not unkindly. "It's too quiet," Eliza admitted, settling onto an overturned crate across from him. "Everything in that place is beautiful, and none of it feels like mine." Amos worked the leather in his hands for a while before answering. "Give it time, girl. Houses don't welcome people. People welcome people. And most folks in that house are still deciding what to make of you. And what do you think they'll decide?" He looked up at her then, his weathered face creasing into something close to a smile. "I think you'll surprise every last one of them. You always did work harder than anybody gave you credit for." It was the first real comfort Eliza had felt since the wedding. Sitting on a crate in a stable that smelled like her old life, talking to a man who had never once looked down on her. She stayed until the lantern burned low, listening to Amos tell stories about the ranch's early years, about Jet's mother and her love of yellow roses, about a land dispute decades old that Amos only mentioned in passing before changing the subject. She would remember that passing mention later. For now, it was simply a story, one thread among many, in a night that finally let her breathe. When she returned to the mansion near midnight, she found Jet waiting in the hallway, still dressed from a day of ranch business, worry etched across his face. "I looked for you," he said. "I thought something had happened." "I went to the stables," Eliza told him. "I needed to remember how to breathe." Something in his expression cracked open, just slightly, and he crossed the space between them and pulled her into an embrace that smelled of leather and cold night air. This house was never meant to be a cage. he said quietly against her hair. "Give me time to make it feel like a home." Eliza let herself lean into him, if only for a moment, and did not tell him about the doubt that still lived in the back of her mind. She did not yet know that the coming weeks would test far more than her patience with a cold household. She did not know that somewhere beyond the estate gates, plans were already forming to make sure she never felt at home in that house at all. Rendell Bridger arrived at the Calder Ranch on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, riding a black stallion worth more than most families in Cedar Hollow earned in a year. He found Jet inspecting a new fence line along the eastern pasture and dismounted without waiting to be welcomed. "I heard the newlyweds are settling in," Rendell said, his tone friendly on the surface, sharp underneath. "The whole town's still talking about your wedding, Jet. Can't say I've heard talk like that in years." Jet did not pause his work. "People will talk about whatever gives them something to say. It doesn't concern me." "It should." Rendell leaned against the fence post, arms crossed. "You've got a seat on the Territorial Council coming up for vote next spring. You know as well as I do that the seat isn't handed to men whose wives scrubbed stalls a season ago. The council answers to old families, old money. They won't look past this marriage, no matter how much land you own. Then they can vote against me," Jet said evenly. "I did not marry Eliza to win a council seat." "No," Rendell agreed, "but you'll lose one because of her. Water rights on that council decide who thrives and who dries up during drought season." "Jet, you've spent 10 years building leverage most men would kill for. Are you really going to throw that away for a woman with no name and no standing?" Jet finally turned to face him fully, and something in his eyes made even Rendell straighten from his casual lean. "She has a name," Jet said. "Eliza Calder. And she has more standing in this valley than half the families who'll be voting on that council, because she has earned every single thing she has ever owned, which is more than most of them can claim." Rendell held his gaze a moment longer, before shrugging and remounting his horse. "Just remember I warned you. When the votes come in against you, pride is a fine thing to have, Jet, right up until it costs you everything you built." He rode off toward his own land, leaving Jet standing at the fence line, with a knot of frustration tightening in his gut. He had known the marriage would draw criticism. He had not fully accounted for how much it would threaten the political ambitions he had spent a decade quietly building, piece by piece, toward a council seat that would let him protect the ranch's water rights for the next generation. That evening, Jet found himself unusually quiet at dinner, turning Rendell's warning over in his mind, while Eliza watched him from across the long table. "Something is troubling you," she finally said. He considered deflecting, then decided against it. Eliza had never once shied away from difficult truths, and he would not insult her by starting now. "Rendell came by today," Jet said. "He reminded me that the council seat vote is coming in spring. He believes our marriage will cost me the seat." Eliza set down her fork carefully. "And do you believe him?" "I believe the old families on that council care more about bloodlines than they care about good management," Jet admitted. "Whether that costs me the seat, I don't know. But I won't pretend the possibility doesn't concern me. That seat controls water rights for half this valley. Losing it could hurt more than just my own ranch." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on her plate. When she looked up, her voice was steady, despite the ache underneath it. "If my presence in your life threatens something this important, Jet, you should tell me plainly. I would rather know the true cost of this marriage than have you carry it silently." "The cost is worth paying," Jet said, without a single second of hesitation. "I did not say this to make you doubt yourself. I said it because I promised you honesty, and I intend to keep that promise, even when the truth is uncomfortable." It was, Eliza thought later, one of the things she trusted most about him. He never softened hard truths into comfortable lies. But trust did not erase the weight of knowing her presence in his life carried a political cost, measured in something as vital as water for an entire valley of families who had never asked to be part of this fight. She lay awake that night beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and made a quiet decision. If the town wished to judge her as unworthy, she would not spend her days hiding from that judgment. She would learn everything she could about the ranch, the council, the water rights that mattered so much to this valley, until no one could claim she did not understand the stakes as clearly as any Calder before her. It was a decision that would, in time, lead her somewhere she never expected, toward an old land dispute Amos had mentioned only in passing, and a truth buried deep in a filing cabinet no one had opened in over 20 years. Coraline Ashworth did not attend social gatherings to enjoy herself. She attended them to gather information, and in a town the size of Cedar Hollow, information traveled fastest through the mouths of people who believed they were simply making pleasant conversation. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, Coraline had turned that skill into a quiet campaign designed to unmake Eliza before she ever had the chance to settle in. It began small, the way these things always do. A comment at the general store about how quickly some girls learn to spend a rich husband's money. A remark over afternoon tea about how convenient it must have been, working in the Calder stables all those years, close enough to notice exactly what kind of man Jet Calder was, and exactly how much he was worth. The rumors grew teeth as they spread. By the 3rd week, half the town believed Eliza had deliberately maneuvered herself into Jet's affections, calculating and patient, waiting years for the right moment to secure a fortune far above her station. The other half simply believed she did not belong, and never would, regardless of her intentions. Eliza first heard the worst of it from Bettina the cook, who mentioned it reluctantly while preparing the evening meal, clearly uncomfortable being the one to deliver the news. "They're saying you planned it," Bettina admitted, not meeting Eliza's eyes. "Saying you set your sights on the master years back and worked your way into his favor, slowly and carefully, like a hunter stalking game." Eliza felt the words land like a slap, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "And what do you believe, Bettina?" The cook paused, considering the question longer than Eliza expected. "I believe I've watched you rise before dawn every single day for years to feed animals that weren't even yours to feed, long before anyone thought you'd ever set foot in this house as anything but staff. Calculating women doesn't work that hard for nothing in return." It was a small kindness, but Eliza held on to it as she made her way to find Jet, determined to tell him what was spreading through the town before he heard it from someone crueler. She found him in his study, poring over ledgers by lamplight, and told him plainly what Coraline had been saying. His jaw tightened as he listened, and when she finished, he set down his pen with controlled precision. "I will speak with her," he said. "That will only give the rumor more attention," Eliza said quickly. "If the wealthiest rancher in the valley storms into a woman's parlor demanding she stop talking, every person in Cedar Hollow will believe there is truth behind it worth defending against." Jet studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his features. "Then what would you have me do?" "Nothing," Eliza said. "Let me handle it my own way." Her way turned out to be simpler than Jet expected, and far more effective than anything he might have done himself. The following Sunday, Eliza attended church alone, without waiting for Jet to escort her, and afterward walked directly to the small circle of women gathered near the chapel steps, Coraline among them. The whispering stopped the moment she approached. Eliza did not flinch from the silence. "I understand. There has been a great deal of talk about how I came to marry Jet Calder," she said, her voice calm and carrying just far enough for the whole circle to hear. "I would rather you hear the truth from me than continue trading rumors that serve no one. I did not scheme for his fortune. I did not wait years calculating an opportunity. I fed his horses and mended his fences because that was the work in front of me, and I did it honestly, the same way I intend to live every day of my life from this point forward. If any of you wish to judge me on what I do, not on what you imagine I planned." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Loretta Whitfield, one of Coraline's closest companions, offered a small, surprised nod. the first crack of respect Eliza had earned from that circle since the wedding. Coraline, however, only smiled thinly. "How very noble," she said. "Though I imagine any woman clever enough to marry above her station would also be clever enough to defend herself with pretty words." Eliza held her gaze without wavering. "Believe what you wish, Coraline. I only came to speak the truth. What you choose to do with it is your own affair." She turned and walked away, spine straight, refusing to look back to see how the circle reacted. It was not a victory. Not entirely. Coraline's campaign did not end that Sunday. But word of Eliza's steady, dignified response spread through the town almost as quickly as the original rumors had. And for the first time since the wedding, a few doubtful minds began to shift, if only slightly, in her favor. Brendel Bridger heard the story that same evening from Coraline herself, delivered with obvious irritation at how poorly her plan had unfolded. He listened carefully, already calculating how a woman with that much composure might prove more difficult to remove from Jet's life than he had. "If words will not unseat her," he said quietly, almost to himself, "we will simply need to find something words cannot argue against." Coraline's eyes sharpened with interest. "What did you have in mind?" Brendel did not answer immediately, but somewhere in the back of his calculating mind, a plan had already begun to take shape, one that would not fully reveal itself until the night of the Harvest Gala, months away, when the entire town would gather beneath the same roof, and an opportunity far more dangerous than gossip would finally present itself. Eliza returned to the stables often in the weeks that followed, drawn back by the same comfort she had found there on her first restless night in the mansion. Amos never questioned her visits. He simply made room on his overturned crate and kept working, letting conversation flow at its own pace, the way it always had between them. It was during one of these evenings, mending tack by lantern light, that Amos first mentioned the old land dispute in real detail. "Does your mother ever talk to you about where her people came from?" Amos asked, apropos of nothing, his weathered hands never pausing in their work. Eliza frowned, surprised by the question. She said little about her family, only that they had once owned land before circumstances forced them to sell. She never spoke of it kindly. "I always assumed it was simply hard times, like so many families in this valley." Amos was quiet for a long moment, his expression unusually careful. "There was a dispute, some 25 years back, over a stretch of land along the North Ridge. Old Calder, Jet's father, bought it up during a bad drought year, when the family who owned it before couldn't keep up with debts. Some folks said the sale wasn't entirely fair. Said the family got pushed out quicker than the paperwork should have allowed." Eliza's pulse quickened. "What family?" Amos hesitated, clearly weighing how much to say. "Marsh family, girl. Your mother's people, if the stories I heard as a young man held any truth to them." The name landed like a stone, dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through everything Eliza thought she understood about her own history. She had grown up believing her family had simply been poor, unlucky, ordinary in their misfortune. She had never once imagined that misfortune might be tangled up with the very family she had married into. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliza returned to the stables often in the weeks that followed, drawn back by the same comfort she had found there on her first restless night in the mansion. Amos never questioned her visits. He simply made room on his overturned crate and kept working, letting conversation flow at its own pace, the way it always had between them. It was during one of these evenings, mending tack by lantern light, that Amos first mentioned the old land dispute in real detail. "Does your mother ever talk to you about where her people came from?" Amos asked, apropos of nothing, his weathered hands never pausing in their work. Eliza frowned, surprised by the question. She said little about her family, only that they had once owned land, before circumstances forced them to sell. She never spoke of it kindly. "I always assumed it was simply hard times, like so many families in this valley." Amos was quiet for a long moment, his expression unusually careful. There was a dispute, some 25 years back, over a stretch of land along the North Ridge. Old Calder, Jet's father, bought it up during a bad drought year, when the family who owned it before couldn't keep up with debts. Some folks said the sale wasn't entirely fair, said the family got pushed out quicker than the paperwork should have allowed. Eliza's pulse quickened. What family? Amos hesitated, clearly weighing how much to say. Marsh family, girl. Your mother's people, if the stories I heard as a young man held any truth to them. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through everything Eliza thought she understood about her own history. She had grown up believing her family had simply been poor, unlucky, ordinary in their misfortune. She had never once imagined that misfortune might be tangled up with the very family she had married into. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Certain enough that I never forgot it," Amos said. Old Calder wasn't a kind man, not the way his son turned out to be. He did what he needed to expand this ranch, and he didn't always ask whether it was right. If you want real answers, girl, you'd need to find the original land records. The county office keeps deeds going back generations, if nobody's destroyed them. Eliza sat with that information long after she returned to the mansion that night, turning it over in her mind, uncertain whether to share it with Jet before she understood it fully herself. She did not want to accuse the man she loved of something his father may have done decades before either of them was born. But she also could not ignore the possibility that her own family's history and the ranch she now called home were bound together by a debt no one had ever settled. The following week, she made the journey into town, under the pretense of visiting the general store, and instead found her way to the county records office, a small building she had passed 1,000 times without ever once setting foot inside. The clerk, an elderly man named Whitcomb, who had held the position longer than most residents could remember, greeted her with polite curiosity. "Mrs. Calder," he said, clearly recognizing her despite never having met her directly. "What can I help you find today?" "I'm looking for land records," Eliza said. "Something from about 25 years back. A sale involving the Northridge property and a family by the name of Marsh." Whitcomb's expression flickered with something Eliza couldn't quite place, gone before she could examine it closely. "That's old business, Mrs. Calder. Records that far back take some digging. Give me a few days and I'll see what I can locate." Eliza thanked him and left, unable to shake the feeling that his brief hesitation meant something more than simple bureaucratic delay. She said nothing of her search to Jet that evening, though she caught him watching her more than once across the dinner table, sensing correctly that something occupied her thoughts. "You've been quiet all week," he finally said, once the staff had cleared the dishes and left them alone. Eliza considered how much to share. She was not yet ready to voice suspicions she could not confirm, suspicions that touched something as sensitive as his father's memory and the very foundation of the ranch he had spent his life building. "I've simply been thinking about my mother," she said, which was not a lie, only an incomplete truth, about where I came from and what she never had the chance to tell me. Jet reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing the same small, comforting circle he had offered on their wedding day. "Whatever you're searching for," he said gently, "I hope you find it, and when you're ready to share it, I will listen without judgment. I promise you that." Eliza held on to that promise in the days that followed, even as the search for answers led her deeper into a mystery that would eventually reshape everything she believed about her own place in Cedar Hollow, and about the ranch that Jet had always assumed belonged, without question, entirely to his own family's legacy. The first accident happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Eliza's visit to the county records office. She had gone to the stables at dawn, as had become her habit, to help Amos with the morning feeding before the rest of the household woke. She was crossing the loft above the main stall row, a walk she had made 10,000 times in her life, when the plank beneath her foot gave way without warning. She caught herself on a support beam, heart hammering, one leg dangling through a hole in the floorboards that should never have opened so suddenly. Amos came running at the sound of her cry, and together they inspected the broken plank, discovering that it had not simply rotted with age. The cut edges were too clean, too deliberate, the work of a saw rather than time and weather. "Somebody did this on purpose," Amos said grimly, running his thumb along the sawn edge. "This wasn't an accident, girl." Eliza said nothing, still shaking from the fall, but she filed the discovery away, alongside a growing list of small, unsettling incidents that had begun accumulating since her visit to the records office. A door to her private sitting room, always left unlocked out of habit, found locked from the inside one afternoon, with no explanation from any of the staff. A note in her own handwriting, one she had written to remind herself of an errand, was found torn into small pieces and left scattered outside her bedroom door. A favorite shawl, gifted to her by Jet during their first weeks of marriage, was discovered singed at the edges near the kitchen hearth, though no one admitted moving it there. Individually, each incident could be explained away as coincidence or carelessness. Together, they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Eliza debated whether to tell Jet, worried that voicing her suspicions without proof would only sound like paranoia born from months of feeling unwelcome in her own home. But the loft incident had been dangerous enough that she could no longer stay silent, and that evening she told him everything, watching his expression darken with each new detail. "Someone in this house wants you gone," Jet said, his voice low and controlled, in the way she had learned meant real anger simmering beneath the surface. "Or wants you frightened enough to leave on your own." "I have no intention of leaving," Eliza said firmly. "I know," Jet said. "That is exactly what worries me. Whoever is behind this may escalate if frightening you quietly does not work." He called Quinn into his study that same night and questioned her directly about the household staff, about who had access to the stable loft, about who might have reason to want Eliza unsettled enough to leave. Quinn's cold composure cracked, just slightly, at the accusation buried in his questions. "I run a household of honest workers, Mr. Calder," she said stiffly. "I will not have you suggest my staff would stoop to such behavior without proof." "I am not accusing your staff," Jet said carefully. "I am asking you to watch more closely, and to tell me immediately if you notice anything unusual. My wife's safety is not a matter I intend to treat lightly, regardless of how long it takes to identify who is responsible." Quinn left the study with her jaw set tight, and Eliza could not tell whether the housekeeper's discomfort came from insulted pride or from something closer to guilt. She filed that uncertainty away as well, alongside every other unanswered question accumulating around her since the day she married into this family. Outside the estate, Rendell Bridger and Coraline Ashworth met quietly at Coraline's parlor, congratulating themselves on a campaign proceeding exactly as planned, though neither spoke the details aloud even to each other, careful to keep their true involvement hidden behind layers of plausible distance. Their true instrument in this scheme remained unseen by either Eliza or Jet, a man both of them trusted in ways they had never thought to question. Sheriff Hollis Stetson had served Cedar Hollow for nearly 15 years, known throughout the valley as a fair and steady lawman, Jet's closest friend since childhood. No one in town would have suspected him of anything, which was precisely why Rendell had approached him months earlier, with an offer too tempting for a man drowning quietly in gambling debts to refuse. Stetson told himself. Each time he tightened another small screw of misfortune around Eliza's life, that he was simply buying himself time, that once his debts were cleared, he would find a way to make things right. He did not yet know how far Rendell intended to push the scheme, or how completely it would eventually implicate him beyond any hope of quiet correction. For now, the sawn plank in the stable loft remained an unsolved mystery. One more shadow gathering at the edges of Eliza's fragile new life, waiting for the night of the harvest gala to bring everything crashing into the light. Whitcomb, the records clerk, sent word to Eliza nearly a month after her original visit, apologizing for the delay and asking her to return to the county office at her earliest convenience. She went the following morning, telling Jet only that she had errands to run in town, still unwilling to share her suspicions until she had something solid enough to bring him. Whitcomb met her with a thin folder of aged documents, his expression carefully neutral as he laid them across the counter between them. "I found what you were looking for," he said. "Though I'll admit, Mrs. Calder, some of what's in here surprised even me." Eliza opened the folder with careful hands and found herself looking at a land deed dated nearly 26 years earlier, the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges, but the ink still legible. The document recorded the sale of a substantial parcel along the North Ridge, transferring ownership from a family named Marsh to Weston Calder, Jet's father, for a sum that struck Eliza immediately as far below any reasonable market value for land that was fertile. But it was the second document, tucked beneath the first, that made her breath catch entirely. It was a separate filing, made only weeks before the sale, recording an amended survey that expanded the boundaries of the Marsh property to include a section of land containing the valley's primary natural spring, a water source that fed the entire ranch's irrigation system to this day. "This survey," Eliza said slowly, tracing the boundary lines with one finger, "it shows my family's land, including the spring. But the ranch has always claimed that the water source came with the original Calder property." Whitcomb nodded slowly. "That's what caught my attention too. Best I can tell, going through the county's older filings, the amended survey never made it into the official record until years after the sale had already gone through. If it had been properly filed beforehand, the sale price your family accepted would have been laughably low for land containing the valley's main water source. Whoever handled that transaction either made a significant error or made sure that survey stayed buried until the deal was already done." Eliza sat with the weight of that information for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications. If the survey was accurate, if it had truly been suppressed until after the sale, then her family had been cheated out of land worth far more than they were ever paid, land that legally may still belong, in some tangled fashion, to her mother's descendants, to her. "Is this deed still valid?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Could this be challenged, even after all these years?" Whitcomb considered the question carefully. "That's a matter for a lawyer, not a records clerk, Mrs. Calder. But I'll say this much. Land disputes involving suppressed surveys have been overturned before, if the paper trail is strong enough, and the original heirs can be clearly established. You'd need more than these two documents, but it's not nothing. It's a real place to start." Eliza thanked him and left the office with the folder clutched carefully against her chest, her mind spinning through possibilities she had never once considered when she married Jet. She had come to this town believing herself to be nothing more than a poor stable girl who had married far above her station, grateful and slightly disbelieving of her own good fortune. Now she stood outside a small county office, holding evidence that suggested she might, by rights long buried and forgotten, be the true owner of the very land her husband's family had built their fortune upon. She did not go directly home. Instead, she rode out to the North Ridge itself, following a trail she had traveled countless times while tending the ranch's cattle, until she reached the natural spring that fed the whole valley's water system. She dismounted and stood at its edge, watching clear water bubble up from some deep, ancient source beneath the earth, trying to reconcile the quiet, ordinary beauty of the place with the enormous weight of what it might mean for her future. If the deed was proven valid, Jet's entire inheritance, the ranch, the water rights, the political power he had spent a decade building, could be called into serious question. She thought of Rendell's warning about the council seat, of Coraline's whispered accusations that she had married for fortune, and felt a bitter irony settle over her. She had never once schemed for wealth. Now she held evidence that might hand her far more wealth and standing than she had ever imagined wanting. Evidence that could just as easily be twisted into proof of exactly the kind of calculated ambition her enemies had already accused her of harboring. She thought of her mother, dying believing her family's misfortune had been simple bad luck, never knowing the truth had been buried in a county filing cabinet for over 2 decades. Grief and anger tangled together in Eliza's chest as she stood at the water's edge, and beneath both emotions ran a quieter, more frightening question. How would Jet react when she finally found the courage to show him what she had found? She rode back to the mansion as the sun began to set, the folder hidden carefully in her saddlebag, uncertain whether she carried in her hands the key to justice long overdue, or the beginning of the end of everything she had only just begun to build. The Harvest Gala was the largest social event Cedar Hollow held each year, a tradition stretching back 3 generations, always hosted at the Calder estate and attended by every family standing in the valley. Lanterns lined the garden paths. Musicians filled the ballroom with music imported from the city. Long tables groaned under the weight of the season's finest food, prepared by Bettina and a team of hired kitchen staff working for days in advance. Eliza had not yet found the courage to show Jet what she discovered at the records office. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment, waiting until she understood the full legal weight of the documents before burdening him with uncertainty. In truth, she was afraid of what the truth might do to a marriage, still finding its footing against a town determined to see it fail. She wore a deep green gown for the gala, a gift from Jet that fit her with a tailored precision no dress from her old life had ever offered. Standing beside him as guests arrived, greeting families she had once served as staff, she felt for the first time something close to belonging, a fragile confidence built from months of steady effort and quiet dignity. That confidence shattered just past midnight. The centerpiece of the Calder family's wealth on public display each year was a jeweled brooch, passed down through 4 generations of Calder women, kept always in a locked display case in the main hall during the gala as a symbol of the family's enduring legacy. It had belonged to Jet's mother, and before her, his grandmother, each woman wearing it once, at her own wedding, before returning it to its case for safekeeping. Near 1 in the morning, a scream rose from the main hall. The display case stood open, shattered glass scattered across the floor, the brooch gone entirely. Within minutes, the gala dissolved into chaos, guests crowding around the broken case, whispers rising into open accusation faster than anyone could contain them. Sheriff Stetson arrived at the scene with practiced efficiency, questioning staff and guests with the calm authority of a man everyone trusted implicitly. It was Coraline who first spoke Eliza's name aloud, her voice carrying with deliberate clarity across the crowded hall. "Has anyone considered," she said, "that the one person in this house who arrived with nothing might be the one person with reason to leave with something?" The accusation spread through the gathered crowd, like fire through dry grass. Rendell added his own quiet fuel, murmuring to nearby guests about how convenient it was that a woman who had married into wealth without a single possession of her own might suddenly find herself in need of funds, mentioning, almost too casually, rumors he claimed to have heard about Eliza's frequent unexplained trips into town over recent weeks. Eliza felt the weight of every eye in the hall turn toward her, the same judgment she had faced on her wedding day, now sharpened into something far more dangerous than gossip. An accusation of theft, if it stuck, would not simply damage her reputation. It could see her formally charged, could give the council all the justification it needed to pressure Jet into an annulment, could end everything she had fought to build in this town. "I did not take that brooch," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "Of course you'd say that," Coraline replied smoothly, "though I imagine it would be easy enough to prove, if the sheriff searched your rooms." Sheriff Stetson's expression flickered with something Eliza could not quite read, gone before she could examine it. "That would be standard procedure," he said, carefully, given the circumstances. Jet stepped forward, before anyone else could speak, positioning himself firmly beside Eliza, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded respect across the valley for a decade. My wife has done nothing to warrant this treatment. I will not allow baseless accusations, spoken by people who have opposed this marriage since its first day, to determine how she is treated in her own home. Baseless, perhaps, Rendell said smoothly, though I imagine a search would settle the matter quickly enough, one way or another, and clear her name beyond any doubt, if she is truly innocent. A crowd murmured agreement, and Eliza understood, with sinking clarity, that refusing the search would only deepen suspicion, regardless of her innocence. She met Jet's eyes and gave a small, resolute nod. "Search my rooms," she said. "I have nothing to hide." The search, conducted under the crowd's watchful attention, turned up nothing in Eliza's private chambers. For a moment, hope flickered that the accusation would collapse under its own weight. Then one of the search party, a deputy under Stetson's command, emerged from the stable loft, the very loft where Eliza had nearly fallen through a sawn plank weeks earlier, holding the missing brooch wrapped inside an old blanket, tucked behind a support beam. The hall erupted into stunned murmurs. Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her, certain in her bones that she had never placed anything in that loft, yet watching an entire room of powerful, judgmental faces reach the same damning conclusion regardless. "I did not put that there," she said, her voice rising with the first real crack of panic she had allowed herself all evening. "Someone placed it to be found. Someone wants this exact conclusion reached." "A convenient claim," Coraline said, though even her voice carried a note of uncertainty now, as if the theatrical perfection of the discovery struck her as slightly too neat. Jet's expression had gone dangerously still, his gaze moving slowly across the gathered crowd, lingering for one telling moment on Sheriff Stetson's face, before shifting to Rendell, then to Coraline, calculating something the entire hall could feel building beneath his controlled exterior. "Someone in this room orchestrated tonight," Jet said, his voice cutting through the murmurs with absolute clarity. "And I intend to find out exactly who, regardless of how long it takes, or whose reputation it damages in the process." The gala ended in disarray, guests departing in hushed, scandalized clusters, carrying the night's events to every corner of the valley by morning. Eliza stood in the wreckage of the broken display case long after the last carriage pulled away, Jet beside her, both of them staring at the empty space where the brooch had once rested, knowing that whoever had engineered this humiliation was still somewhere close, still watching, still waiting to see whether their plan had finally succeeded in tearing the Calder marriage apart. Jet did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after Eliza finally succumbed to exhausted, uneasy rest, turning the evening's events over in his mind with the same methodical patience he applied to every difficult negotiation he had ever conducted. Someone had known exactly where to plant that brooch. Someone had known about the stable loft, about the sawn plank incident weeks earlier, about every small detail of Eliza's daily movements through the estate. That kind of knowledge required more than casual gossip. It required access and trust and a position close enough to the family to move unnoticed. By dawn, Jet had a working theory, and he did not like where it led. He sent word requesting Sheriff Stetson's presence at the ranch, framing the request as routine follow-up to the investigation. Stetson arrived within the hour, his manner as calm and steady as always, though Jet noticed, for the first time in 15 years of friendship, a slight tightness around the sheriff's eyes that had not been there before. "I want to understand something," Jet said, once they were alone in his study. "You searched the stable loft yourself, or your deputy did, at your direction. How did either of you know precisely where to look?" Stetson's expression remained carefully composed. "Standard procedure, Jet. We searched the entire property systematically. The loft is a large space," Jet pressed. "Your deputy found the brooch within minutes, tucked behind a specific support beam, in a section of the loft that required knowing exactly where a plank had recently been sawn through and repaired. That is not the kind of detail a stranger would stumble upon by chance." Stetson said nothing, And in the silence, Jet felt his last shred of doubt collapse entirely. "You knew about the sawn plank," Jet said quietly, "because you were the one who cut it." For a long moment, Stetson said nothing at all, and the silence between two men who had grown up together, who had hunted these same hills as boys, who had trusted each other through 15 years of adulthood, stretched thin enough to break. "I never wanted it to go this far," Stetson finally said, his composed mask finally cracking, revealing something exhausted and desperate underneath. "Rendell approached me months ago. I owe money, Jet. Gambling debts, more than I could ever repay on a sheriff's salary. He offered to clear them, if I helped make your marriage difficult enough that you'd reconsider it, or difficult enough that the council would have grounds to push for an annulment before the spring vote. And when small troubles weren't enough," Jet said, his voice deceptively quiet, "you helped him frame my wife for theft." Stetson's shoulders sagged. The brooch was never stolen at all, Jet. Rendell had it removed from the case earlier that evening, before the gala even began, using a spare key Coraline acquired months ago during her courtship with you. We planted it in the loft to be discovered during the search, knowing suspicion would already be pointed toward Eliza after Coraline's comments in the hall. Jet absorbed this confession with a stillness that frightened Stetson more than any outburst could have. "You conspired to destroy an innocent woman's reputation, possibly her freedom, to settle your own debts." "I know what I've done," Stetson said. "I have known it every single night since Rendell first approached me, and I have hated myself a little more with each small task he asked of me. I am telling you the truth now, because I cannot carry this any further." Jet stood, his expression carved from granite. "You will repeat this confession publicly, to the council, to the entire valley if necessary. You will clear my wife's name completely, and you will face whatever consequences the law demands for what you have done, regardless of our history." Stetson nodded slowly, resigned. "I expected nothing less." 3 days later, the town council convened an emergency session, called at Jet's insistence, to address the scandal surrounding the Harvest Gala theft. The hall filled with the same faces that had gathered to judge Eliza on her wedding day, now waiting with equal hunger to hear how the story would resolve. Stetson stood before the council and delivered his confession without flinching, detailing Rendell's involvement, Coraline's role in acquiring the spare key, and his own desperate complicity across months of small, cowardly acts, designed to unravel a marriage that had never once threatened anyone but the ambitions of those determined to see it fail. Rendell attempted denial, then bargaining, then outright anger, but Stetson's detailed confession, corroborated by the deputy who had found the brooch, and by a servant who confirmed seeing Coraline near the display case earlier that evening, left no room for doubt. The council stripped Rendell of his standing within the Valley's Ranching Association, effectively ending his influence over the water rights disputes he had spent years maneuvering to control. Coraline, disgraced beyond any hope of quiet recovery, left Cedar Hollow within the month, her family's name tarnished by association with a scheme that had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's life. Eliza sat beside Jet throughout the entire session, her spine straight, her expression composed, though relief and vindication moved through her chest like a long-held breath finally released. When the council formally cleared her name, a ripple of applause moved through the hall, tentative at first, then stronger, as the same townsfolk who had once turned their backs on her wedding day found themselves, however reluctantly, forced to reckon with the courage she had shown throughout the ordeal. That evening, back at the estate, Jet took both of Eliza's hands in his own, his relief so profound it left him momentarily unable to find the right words. "I should have seen it sooner," he finally said. "I should have protected you from all of it. You could not have known your oldest friend was capable of this," Eliza said gently. "None of us could have. I still failed you," Jet said. "I let you carry the weight of suspicion alone for months, while I was too consumed with the ranch, with the council seat, to notice how much danger had already gathered around you." Eliza reached up and touched his face, her thumb tracing the same small, comforting circle he had once offered her. "You are here now," she said. "That matters more than any of the mistakes that came before it." There was, however, one truth she had not yet shared, one piece of this tangled story still waiting in a folder hidden in her wardrobe, a secret that would soon prove far more complicated than any theft accusation Rendell and Coraline had ever engineered against her. Eliza waited until the dust of the council scandal had fully settled before finally showing Jet what she had discovered at the records office months earlier. She chose a quiet evening on the East Terrace, the same place they had shared coffee together during her first uncertain weeks in this house, and laid the aged land deed and the amended survey on the table between them, without a single word of preamble. Jet read both documents slowly, twice, his expression moving through confusion, then dawning understanding, then something far more complicated, as the full implications settled over him. "This survey," he finally said, "shows the North Spring on marshland, land my father bought from your family." Before the survey was properly filed, Eliza confirmed, "Whitcomb believes it was deliberately suppressed until after the sale closed, so your father would only pay for ordinary grazing land, not for the property containing the valley's primary water source." Jet sat back slowly, running one hand through his hair, the weight of generations of assumed inheritance shifting beneath him in ways he had never once anticipated. If this is true, if this can be proven in a proper court, the water rights this entire ranch has operated under for 26 years could be called into serious question. My father's legacy, my own inheritance, all of it built partly on a sale that was never entirely honest. "I did not come to you with this to threaten your inheritance," Eliza said quietly. "I found it while searching for answers about my own family's history, answers I never expected to lead anywhere near your father's dealings. I have debated for weeks whether to tell you at all, afraid of exactly this moment, afraid of what it might mean for us." Jet was quiet for a long time, staring out over the pastures that stretched toward the very ridge in question, pastures he had ridden across since he was a boy learning to sit a horse. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that surprised even Eliza. "My father was not always an honest man," he said. "I knew that, in pieces, growing up. I chose not to examine it too closely, because examining it meant questioning everything I inherited from him. I cannot undo what he did 26 years ago, but I can choose, right now, what kind of man I intend to be with the knowledge you have brought me." "What are you saying?" Eliza asked carefully. "I am saying that if this land was taken from your family through deception, then by rights, some portion of this ranch and the water that sustains it belongs to you," Jet said. "Not as my wife, inheriting through marriage, but as a Marsh descendant, inheriting through a truth that was buried for far too long. I will not fight you for what should never have been taken from your family in the first place." Eliza felt tears gathering that she had not expected. Months of grief for a mother who never knew the truth, finally finding somewhere honest to land. "I did not marry you for land, Jet. I married you because you were the first person who ever looked at me and saw more than my circumstances." "I know that," Jet said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "which is exactly why I trust you with this. We will take these documents to a proper lawyer, formalize the truth of your family's claim, and restructure the ranch's ownership to reflect it honestly. Not because the law demands it, though eventually it may, but because it is the right thing to do, and because I would rather build our future on honest ground than on a debt my father never repaid." The legal process that followed took the better part of a year, quiet and unglamorous compared to the drama of the Harvest Gala scandal, but no less significant for its lack of spectacle. Whitcomb's records proved sufficient foundation for a formal claim, and rather than fight the matter through lengthy court battles, Jet chose to voluntarily restructure the ranch's ownership, formally recognizing Eliza's family claim to the North Ridge and the spring it contained, folding that recognition into their shared marriage, rather than treating it as a separate grievance to be settled between adversaries. The town, predictably, found new things to whisper about. But the whispers carried a different tone now, tinged with something closer to respect than scorn. The woman who had once been dismissed as nothing more than a stable girl who married above her station now stood as a landowner in her own right, her claim validated not by marriage, but by a truth she had uncovered through her own persistence and courage. Quinn, the once icy housekeeper, was among the first in the household to formally acknowledge the shift, arriving one morning with a small bouquet of yellow roses cut from the estate garden, offered without a word of the earlier coldness that had defined their first months together. "You have earned your place in this house," Quinn said simply, setting the roses on Eliza's desk. "I should have seen it sooner." "Thank you, Quinn," Eliza said, and meant it fully. The following spring, Jet stood for the council seat vote as planned, and though a few old families still murmured about the unconventional path his marriage and his ranch's ownership had taken, the overwhelming truth of the Stetson confession and the honest, transparent way Jet had handled the land dispute won him more respect than his critics had ever expected. He won the seat by a comfortable margin and used his first act in office to propose new protections for water rights across the valley, ensuring no family, wealthy or poor, would ever again lose land through the kind of quiet deception that had once cost the Marsh family everything. Eliza stood beside him at the ceremony marking his appointment, no longer the girl who slept above the stables with nothing to her name, no longer defined solely by where she had come from, but standing instead as a woman who had faced a town's judgment, a conspiracy against her freedom, and a truth buried for over 2 decades, and had emerged from all of it with her integrity fully intact. That evening, back at the estate, she walked the long hallway lined with colder ancestors, past portraits that had once made her feel like an intruder in her own home, and stopped at the small table beneath the tall window where she had arranged yellow roses on her very first day in this house. She cut a fresh bundle from the garden and arranged them once more in the same old blue vase, no longer a small act of quiet defiance, but simply a small act of belonging, in a home that had finally, fully, become her own. Jet found her there, as he had on that first afternoon, and crossed the hallway to stand beside her, studying the roses with the same quiet appreciation he had shown all those months before. "Yellow roses," he said softly. "My mother's favorite, and mine," Eliza said, "for reasons I never expected, in a place I never expected to call home." Outside the tall windows, the valley stretched toward the North Ridge and the spring that fed it, no longer a symbol of old debts and buried deception, but of a future 2 people had chosen to build honestly, together, on ground finally set right after 26 long years. The lesson of their story was not that love conquers every obstacle without cost, for Eliza and Jet had both paid dearly for the life they built together. It was, instead, a simpler truth, one worth carrying forward long after the gossip of Cedar Hollow had finally quieted for good. That dignity, honesty, and the courage to seek truth, even when it is inconvenient, will always outlast the judgment of those who mistake wealth and old bloodlines for real worth. Eliza Calder had arrived in that grand hallway with nothing but a bundle of yellow roses and a quiet resolve to be judged by her actions rather than her origins. She left it, in the end, having taught an entire valley that a person's worth was never measured by where they began, but by how honestly and how bravely they chose to stand when the whole world was watching.